Chapter 40. Evacuation. Matthew Simmons. Virginia, 2018. For the past few days I'd barely slept. My wounds were healing well, and I'd managed to stave off infection thanks to the medical care of Leanne and the other white coats. I was even walking semi-normally again. And while I and the other people in the Eden Corporation laboratory had gotten off on the wrong foot when I'd briefly taken Roger hostage for information, stolen my gun from him, and then refused to give it back, we'd all come to appreciate that, like it or not, we were in this together. Roger, of course, still seemed to think that what he knew about Alex Vussel and his deliberate spread of the infection was the most important thing in the world, that we all owed it to mankind to make sure that the truth, above all else, survived the oncoming aerial bombardment and made its way into the outside world. I, of course, knew better. Because while people can put every ounce of themselves into seeking justice or into exacting revenge, in the end, it doesn't mean a damn thing. And it doesn't change a damn thing. I'd learned that lesson long ago. But that wasn't what was keeping me from sleeping. We had less than 2 days now until a remote drone program bombed the laboratory we were in and incinerated both the hordes of undead surrounding it and us inside. We had less than 2 days to find a way out that wouldn't lead us into the arms of the undead, wouldn't force us to jump from the roof onto those of nearby buildings, or try some kind of insane zip line like some shit you'd see in a movie. Instead, we had only practical options and real people. And since I was the resident ghoul expert, trained military personnel, and the only one with a gun, it had fallen on my shoulders to try and come up with an idea or plan that could see not just me or Roger to safety, but everyone else as well. The mood was grim, and with each passing day it only got worse. At first, I think people allowed themselves to believe that I'd be able to get them to safety. First, I believed it too. But now, as the days wound down and we approached the time when we would have no choice but to leave, my preparations for our escape, while plentiful and impressive, remained fundamentally flawed and entirely dependent on luck. Ghouls are wretched and horrific creatures that fortunately have very important flaws and weaknesses. Due to the natural decomposition of their rotten bodies, their senses slowly deteriorate over time. The first to fade is their sense of sight, as the eyes turn milky and clouded. Rigor mortis quickly sets in, causing them to move slowly and rigidly. They moan constantly to attract other ghouls and create large, dense hordes that relentlessly pursue their prey, primarily navigating by smell, sound, and vibrations. Alone, they're feeble and easily avoided. But in a town that had a population of 15,000 people, damn near all of which had since become infected and surrounded the buildings around the one we were trapped in, our chances of so much as making it out of the building, let alone out of the town, were slim to say the least. Fortunately, because the laboratory we were staying in was on such a high floor of the building, the ghouls hadn't all pressed up against the Eden Corp facility, pursuing us alone. Instead, from my frequent trips to the roof to look out over the surrounding structures and pockets of undead, I realized that there were a few other buildings that had lured their attention, no doubt containing more people who had managed to survive somehow. This was our best chance and our only hope of escape, scattering the mobs of infected with distractions and trickery while we made a run for it. It was the middle of the night when the storm that had been building finally struck, lightning and thunder announcing its arrival. I could tell from the way the clouds looked before the sun set that it was going to be a bad one, temporarily dulling the noise of moaning ghouls with a hammering of water. A little bit of peace that we could all use. But it wasn't the storm that pulled me out of the few minutes of sleep I'd managed to catch. Instead, it was a flashing red monitor and a repeating beeping sound like something you'd hear from a cell phone. Nobody else seemed to notice, lying deep asleep on their makeshift beds, stretching from one end of the laboratory to the other. I pushed myself off the floor and picked up my weapon, never without it by my side, and made my way to the computer, the console that we left on at all times to keep track of the targeting systems of the drone base. Then, as I came to stand before it, reading the now drastically different estimated time of bombardment, my heart stopped and my mind began to race. The drones were on their way. The bombardment was ahead of schedule, and we had a little less than 2 hours until each and every one of us were blown to hell. I took a seat at the computer console and briefly contemplated our options, looking out over the few handfuls of people that I'd come to know, wondering whether or not I should bother to wake them up at all, wondering whether or not they'd rather I say nothing and leave them to a peaceful, unsuspecting death, or startle them awake and rush them out of the building to be eaten alive. For although I had made many of the necessary preparations to escape, I knew most of us likely wouldn't make it alive. Most of them would be too weak, or fearful, or confused to do exactly as I said. But it wasn't until my eyes came to rest on Leanne, the beautiful brunette who I had practically fallen in love with the first time I saw her, that I realized I wasn't willing to give up my chance at life or sacrifice anyone else's without their consent. We had to try, and we had to do it now. I stood up, popped open the bottle of painkillers that I'd been taking to deal with my leg, swallowed 10 of them, and then hit the lights. "Everybody up now," I screamed, hobbling down the length of the room as groggy and disoriented white coats raised their heads from their pillows. Roger was one of the first to his feet and quickly rushed over to the computer console, realizing immediately what had happened and what I was doing. It was go time. The window I had burst through when I'd first entered the Eden Court building overlooked a gridlocked intersection of cars and ghouls, directly adjacent to another building that I could only assume still had survivors in it. There, above all other places nearby, was where the undead had chosen to rally, slamming their rotten hands against the doors as they tried to break in. However, since then, that room had become dedicated to building makeshift explosives and rockets. Tanks of flammable gas and chemicals had been rigged to detonate over the period of a few minutes, giving everyone just enough time to exit out the opposite side of the building by descending down a few rope ladders that we had built. Roger soon arrived after getting everyone in their positions and helped me push the tanks of gas around the room, teetering them on the edge of the broken window out over the festering pool of ghouls and quickly rising water, only visible to us every few seconds as flashes of lightning illuminated the bowels of hell. "The sewage system's backed up," Roger exclaimed, pointing to the number of bodies that lined the streets, clogging drains and creating a lake of corpses, feces, cars, and rainwater. I nodded in return, smacking my leg to numb it until the painkillers kicked in. Then, as I stared out over the carnage of what awaited us below, I realized a blessing in disguise that might just see us through this. The storm. Ghouls could barely see as it was, and the blotted-out moon and occasional lightning flashes would only serve to throw them off guard even more. The pouring rain that was mixing with the sewage would make everything smell like the same putrid mix of shit and even minimize the vibrations that could be felt from our moving. Jesus fucking Christ, we might just have a chance. But then again, it would slow our movements just as much as it would throw the ghouls off our trail. I didn't let myself get my hopes up anymore. Fate fucks both ways. "Everybody's in position, right?" I asked Roger, sliding the first anchor tank that would subsequently pull others down along with it to the very edge of the window, held back only by Roger and me. He nodded apprehensively, knowing there was no turning back now. I took a deep breath and let go, watching as the tank fell the few short stories down onto the street, crashing onto a car before slamming into a ghoul and sinking underwater. Roger and I turned and ran, only 1 minute until the timer detonated and the fireworks began. Everyone else was by the exit window that we had smashed out earlier, holding on to the rope ladders, waiting for my command to lower them just like they were supposed to. Lightning flashed a few times, giving us a good view of the few lingering ghouls that we would have to wait to wander away before we could throw the rope ladders down and start evacuating everyone. The room breathed heavily, fearfully, as people tried to prepare themselves for what was ahead. I stepped to the edge of the window and took the rope ladder from one of the white coats, all of whom, since the evacuation order had been made, had removed any bright clothing that could give them away in the dead of night and replaced it with plain clothes. I placed my hand on the man's shoulder reassuringly and turned to make my final address to the crowd. All right, everyone. Remember what I told you and do nothing else. Any sudden movement will not only get you surrounded, but everyone else here as well. Follow my lead. Keep your hand on the shoulder of the person in front of you. Do not look back, and no matter what happens, do not scream. Whether it's to help someone or not, do not scream, all right? I exclaimed, looking down at my watch as the 5-second countdown began. Everybody nodded. Nobody said a word. Showtime. A sudden explosion that sounded and felt like a truck hitting the side of the building sent vibrations out across the town, rippling the surface of the rising sewage water and pulling the attention of every ghoul in its direction. Lightning flashed a few more times, allowing us to see momentary glimpses of the ghouls below us as they turned and lumbered in the direction of the blast. A warm, fiery chemical glow emanated from where we had set the charges, and a moment later, I dropped the first ladder and began climbing down. I lowered my feet into the freezing, rotten water that smelled like death soaked in shit, eventually feeling it strike the firm grip of the asphalt below. The others followed quickly behind me, knowing that we only had approximately 5 minutes of periodic explosions and the subsequent fires that would burn afterwards to give us the cover we needed to flee. I waited until the person behind me had caught up until I began moving forward, practically blind in the pitch-black, moonless night. The rain poured down heavily, making it seem like everything around us was moving. But that wasn't the worst part. The water was literally filled with corpses, either those of people who had died without contracting the disease, or of the infected trapped underwater, waiting to spring to the surface and pull us under. I breathed slowly, terrified, but forcing myself to stay calm. I moved gracefully, feeling the tight grasp of the person behind me dig into my shoulder muscles. I had mounted a flashlight onto the top of my gun in case of emergency. The group knew that if they saw that light go on, the only thing they could do was run. But until then, no shots could be fired, and we had no choice but to rely on the occasional lightning flash to see where we were going and hope we would make it out alive. Another explosion flashed a faint glimmer of light across our path, and I could feel the shudder pass along everyone in the human chain we formed. Within a few meters of us, some ghouls could be seen, drudging in our direction, their hands stretched outwards and their mouths wide open. I stopped dead in my tracks, and the chain of people behind me did too, just as they were trained to do. Nobody moved. The ghouls' moans swam through the sounds of pounding rain, and I could feel the trembling hand of the man behind me slightly shoving me, either from his own fear or because of that of those behind him. However, I didn't dare draw attention to ourselves, and it wasn't until the next flash of lightning struck that I could see that the ghouls had moved past us toward the still-burning chemical fire we had left behind. The distraction was working. It was actually working. I thank God for the storm to cover our tracks and swallow us in the night, sliding my feet slowly forward, despite the frequent bumps against cold, moving flesh buried in the now waist-high water. We moved slowly, painfully slowly. The lightning shocked our hearts every time it struck, and the occasional explosions from the building we had just evacuated added another startling edge to our nerves. My free hand was stretched outwards, bumping against car doors and broken glass. I wore a thick glove on it to keep from hurting myself, but that same glove kept me from knowing exactly what it was I was touching. Then, after a few more moments of pitch black, without the guiding help of lightning, my hand jabbed into something fleshy standing right in front of me. I froze once more and held my breath, hearing the sound of a ghoul's moan emerge as the water rushed out of its mouth and splashed down onto my chest. It had just stood up. It had just surfaced, and I just bumped into the motherfucking thing. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I waited, panicking in that moment, until I felt its cold hands stretch out and graze against my shirt collar, searching for whatever it had just encountered. Then, as its hands moved towards my throat, I decided I had no choice but to react. I quickly thrust my hand out and shoved it aside, knocking it off balance and sending it back into the depths of the water with the hope that by the time it surfaced we would be gone. I started moving forward again, trembling with fear. A few moments later, after another strike of lightning to see where we would have to move and turn next, I felt a sudden jolt in the line of hands connecting one person to another. The hand on my shoulder swayed from the force of something pulling on it from behind, either from a ghoul or another one of the white coats. Only I had no way of knowing. I tried to move forward again, but then felt the hand pull me back, holding me where I was. Then, seconds later, I heard a muffled scream, as if someone had a hand placed over their mouth. It quickly disappeared into the water. I turned around, doing exactly what I had instructed everyone else not to, and I hoped and prayed that I would have a moment of lightning that would tell me what I needed to know. I hoped and prayed that we hadn't been surrounded, and that the ghoul I had pushed aside hadn't found its way back to the end of the line. And then, just as I ran the thought through my head once more, I got what I'd been praying for. The lightning illuminated the sky just as another explosion burst from the Eden Corporation laboratory, a giant, colorful blue and purple blast that would indicate to everyone that there would be no more after it. However, it wasn't the fire that caught my attention most. It was the 15 or 20 ghouls that had somehow managed to find themselves on all sides of us, particularly in front of us, headed right for me. The line remained intact, but the people standing in it had never looked more terrified. The fading glow of the explosion illuminated the area just enough for me to see a line of cars, the roofs of which protruded out of the water, and as I looked around to try and see a clear way to move or any way out, I realized we would have no choice but to either get out of the way of the oncoming swarm or fall victim to it. I slowly turned around and leaned into the ear of the man holding my shoulder, whispering an instruction for him to pass down the line. "Tell everyone to get on top of the cars and then don't move," I instructed, immediately after which another bolt of lightning struck which showed the approaching pack of ghouls were walking faster than I'd hoped. I had to move now. We had to move now. I felt the man behind me turn to pass my message along, but I knew I could never reach everyone in time. I knew that either they would be lost and alone, or we would all be dead and infected. I didn't hesitate. God damn me, I didn't hesitate. I moved quickly forward and climbed up onto the roof of a car, feeling the man's hand pry off of my shoulder. I lay flat and held my breath, hearing the sound of moans pass along every side of me, walking around the car I had just moved on top of. But without lightning, without light, I had no way of knowing what had happened to the group behind me. My eyes searched desperately through the darkness for any sign of them, for any sound of them, but found nothing. A few more moments passed of sickening silence and darkness until yet another lightning flash struck, and I could see that a handful of people had managed to make it onto the tops of cars. The others, standing motionless, fortunate enough to be ignored or unnoticed, had no choice but to listen helplessly as a few of their friends were surrounded and dragged under the water. I swiveled my head around to look in the direction we had been heading. Only a couple more blocks now until we reached the outer border of town where the steep hills that surrounded it climbed upwards and outwards into the forest. I had descended those hills and found myself trapped here weeks ago, and now that I was so close to them again, I felt my body yearning to run, pushing me to leave everyone behind and use all the strength I had to escape. But I didn't. I stayed put. And everyone who had managed to receive my message and get on top of or inside of a car had no choice but to listen and watch as the others were attacked and eaten, their faint and muffled screams quickly disappearing into the water. I don't know how long we waited there, hearing the subtle nuances of a woman's throat opening just as her last breath of air escaped her lungs into the murky water. The horrifying slop of wet, undead hands against trembling, tender meat, torn limb from limb. It was hell. We were in hell, and we had no choice but to wait and pray for it to end. A few more flashes of lightning, and soon the ghouls had moved on, continuing towards the burning side of the building that we had left for them. I peered ahead, seeing nothing and no one, and then, after getting the attention of those still around who could follow me, I slid off the car and back into the water, grabbing hands with the person behind me and reforming the chain. A few more steps, and the terrain began to change. It was getting muddier, less stable, no doubt a result of the eroding hills sloping up and gathering mud from the severity of the rain. A few more steps after that, and I could feel the water level start to lower. We were walking out of it. We were rising out of it. I held tightly onto the person behind me with one hand and onto my gun with the other. Soon, however many of us were left had made it out of the water, and from another sudden flash of lightning, I could see that the coast seemed to be clear. I waited a moment and managed to gather everyone together in a circle so that we could whisper what had happened and come to understand what would happen next. Okay. All we have to do now is walk up this hill and then head into the woods, I instructed, feeling everyone tremble from the cold of the rain and the devastating fear in their hearts. I had no idea who I was talking to, but I knew they needed me. After that, we can rest, huddle together for warmth, and stay alert. Roger isn't here, I heard Leanne whimper, thanking God that she was one of the few people who had made it through. What happened to him? Why did everyone move so suddenly? I tried to send a message back to everyone, but there was no time. The ghouls surrounded us, and I tried to explain, only to be cut off by a man's voice. We cannot stay here. We need to move. What about the others? Another man asked. We need to move now, a hiss responded. Look, everyone just follow me. We can't go back. I told you before. I warned you before. We can't go back. The crowd silently admitted that I was right, and accepted that if we didn't start moving while the ghouls in town were distracted, we too would never get the chance to leave. I turned back towards the road and began our ascent into the woods, into the rocky, uneven terrain that the undead could only stumble briefly upon without tripping over or falling on a tree root. If we made it until daylight, we knew the road we had to take to reach the military base Roger had told us about, the place where he was supposed to report after his rescue squad had arrived. What I knew, however, that I didn't dare crush everyone else's hopes with, was that likely that very base was overrun with ghouls as well. Our best chances of survival would be to continue to lose people until only a few remained. The strong ones, the fighters. And then, if we had any luck at all, we'd start running for as long as our feet could carry us until either we were eaten alive or the bullets I had left in my rifle spared us from that fate. I thought of my brother in that moment. I wished I could have seen him again. I wished I could have had the sense to forgive myself for what I'd done to him enough to be able to face him again, to look him in the eye and spit on my own foolish pride. And in that moment, I promised myself that if I got out of this, if I led this group of people out of this, then I would do everything in my power to get back home. I would see him again. I would make things right. And together, we could face hell. But then again, that was just wishful thinking. I knew I was going to die. I just knew it. And the only reason I thought of him and promised myself those things was because it was the greatest regret I had in my life and the only thing I wished I'd never done and would give anything to make it right again. And then, despite the feeling in my gut pulling at my soul, reassuring me that I was a hair's breadth away from death, we reached the top of the hill and entered the forest.